I used to work part-time at a small regional airport in Colorado. Nothing fancy, just one terminal, 3 gates, and the occasional corporate jet or charter flight. Most of the time, it was slow. My job was pretty simple. Clean up after hours, handle basic maintenance, and lock everything down before leaving at midnight. It wasn't exciting, but it paid well enough, and I liked the quiet. There was only one other person on the night crew, a guy named Roy who worked security. He was about 20 years older than me and had been there forever. Roy was one of those guys who didn't talk much unless he had a reason to, but when he did, you listened. He knew every inch of that airport, and something about the way he carried himself made you trust him. One night, toward the end of September, I was scheduled to close alone. Roy had called out sick for the first time in years, and management said I'd be fine solo for one night. It wasn't like anyone was flying in after 9 p.m. anyway. By 10, I was just doing my rounds, checking that all bathrooms were empty, windows locked, and lights shut off one by one. The silence in a place that usually buzzes with activity, it always got under my skin a little. Especially once the HVAC shut off and the only sound left was the soft hum of the vending machines. I made my way through the terminal, wiping down seats, taking out trash. Everything was normal until I got to gate 3. The door to the jet bridge was ajar. Now these doors are always locked when not in use. Always. No one should have been out there. I figured maybe one of the pilots or ground crew forgot to shut it after that evening's flight, so I went to close it. As I pushed it open a bit more to see into the bridge, I got this weird sensation, like walking into a room that's colder than it should be. The air felt heavier too. I flicked my flashlight on and stepped inside. The bridge was empty, but there was condensation on the inside windows, like someone had breathed on them. One panel near the end of the bridge even had a foggy streak, as if a hand had been dragged across it. I stood still for a second, heart beating a little faster. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not behind me. Not on the tarmac below. Inside the bridge. They were light and slow, almost dragging, but unmistakable. I spun around, flashlight aimed dead ahead. No one. The footsteps stopped. I backed out of the bridge fast, slammed the door, and locked it. I told myself it was probably my imagination. Maybe a bird landed on the roof, maybe the building was settling. You learn to rationalize when you're alone at night. I moved on with my rounds, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner or walked down a long hallway, I felt like something or someone was a few steps behind. Around 11:15, I headed to the control room to check the CCTV monitors before final lockup. It's just standard procedure. Make sure no one's lingering in the terminal or parking lot. The monitors were all black and white, kind of grainy, but functional. I clicked through each feed, room by room, all clear. Then I got to gate 3. There was something standing in the bridge. I leaned closer, squinting at the monitor. It looked like a person. A tall, thin figure facing away from the camera toward the window, arms at its side. I blinked and looked again. The figure was gone. I rewound the feed. It wasn't there a few seconds ago. Then it was. Then it wasn't. My first instinct was to assume the camera had glitched, maybe a reflection. But deep down, I didn't buy it. The image had looked too solid, too human. I shut off the feed and told myself I'd finish my checklist and be out of there in 20 minutes. I was almost done anyway. That's when I got the call. The airport phone rang, a shrill, jarring sound in the dead quiet. No one ever calls that line after hours. It's for emergencies only. I picked it up. Operations, this is Mike. There was a long pause, then a whisper. Gate 3. That's all they said. I stood there frozen, the receiver still pressed to my ear. Who is this? I asked, trying to sound calm. Click. They hung up. I ran back to the control room and pulled up the gate 3 feed again. Empty. But this time, the door to the bridge was open. I hadn't unlocked it. I know I hadn't. That was it. I wasn't sticking around. I radioed in, said there was a malfunction and I was shutting down early for safety. Management could chew me out in the morning. I went to lock the front doors of the terminal. As I did, I looked out at the tarmac. A shadow moved. It darted between 2 parked luggage carts. I waited, hoping I'd imagined it. But a few seconds later, I saw it again. Someone or something was out there. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and left. The next day, I told Roy everything. He didn't laugh, didn't even look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, Gate 3. He told me a story from years ago about a late-night flight that landed in a snowstorm. The plane was misaligned with the bridge, and the crew took too long connecting it. A woman, an older passenger, panicked and opened the emergency exit, thinking it was safe. She fell 30 feet onto the tarmac, died instantly. They said she was disoriented. But some of the old staff always believed her ghost still lingered around Gate 3, restless, waiting. I didn't take another solo shift for months after that. And to this day, every time I walk past a jet bridge, especially at night, I can't help but glance inside, just to make sure no one's there. Watching, waiting, again. I was stationed at a remote military outpost in northern Alaska back in 2009. Our job was mostly surveillance, monitoring the radar station and maintaining the long-range sensors that tracked aircraft. Most of the time it was dull and uneventful, but the kind of isolation that comes with being in the middle of nowhere does things to your mind. There were only about 8 of us on rotation at the station at any given time. We were resupplied once every 2 weeks, and sometimes, during rough weather, they wouldn't even make it. The cold was harsh, and the darkness felt endless in the winter. The only warmth came from the barracks heater and the banter between bored servicemen trying to stay sane. We were halfway through a brutal 4-week rotation. That night, our tech systems started having strange glitches. The radar array started flickering, and we were getting error codes we didn't recognize. The screen would just flash a string of coordinates and then reset. No weather issues, no aircraft, just static and numbers. At first, we chalked it up to faulty equipment. These systems were old, and maintenance was always a problem. But then the numbers repeated. Same exact coordinates, over and over again. One of the guys, Sullivan, ran them through a mapping program just for fun. The location was about 11 miles from our outpost, deep in the tundra, where there was nothing. No paths, no structures, just snow and ice. We radioed it into command, but they brushed it off, told us it was probably a glitch in the sensor or a bad satellite ping. But Sullivan wasn't convinced. He said he'd seen something like this before during his last assignment. Another outpost had similar malfunctions just days before an avalanche destroyed one of their towers. He wanted to go check it out, just to be safe. Our commanding NCO reluctantly gave us the go-ahead, but said only 2 could go. So Sullivan and I geared up, loaded a snowmobile with supplies, and headed out. The sun was barely touching the horizon, typical for that time of year. The cold cut through our outer layers like needles. It was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of snow under the sled. After about 2 hours, we reached the coordinates. I was expecting nothing, honestly, but there was something out there. It looked like a weathered concrete hatch, old and sunken halfway into the snow. No markings, no wires, just a square of rusted metal with a handle. Sullivan looked at me, wide-eyed like he'd just struck gold. We thought maybe it was some forgotten Cold War installation. The military built weird stuff out here back in the day. Underground bunkers, fallout shelters, early warning stations. It wouldn't be out of the question. Sullivan insisted we open it. I was hesitant, but I agreed. We spent nearly 40 minutes chiseling through the ice that had sealed the door shut. Eventually, with both of us pulling, the hatch groaned open, revealing a narrow shaft with a rusted ladder leading straight down into pitch black. There was a smell that hit us immediately, old, damp, and something else, like metal and rot. But we'd come this far. We clicked on our helmet lights and descended. The shaft went down maybe 40 feet before opening into a corridor. The walls were lined with steel, pipes ran overhead, and water dripped from somewhere we couldn't see. There were faded labels on the walls, Lab 3A, Storage, Quarters, all in English, all military standard font. But there was no power, no generator hum, no lights. We moved deeper, turning corner after corner. That smell was stronger now, sour and earthy. The corridor eventually opened into a larger room, some kind of control center. Rows of rusted computer equipment, monitors shattered or missing. Sullivan was snapping pictures with his phone while I stood near the door, flashlight beam bouncing across dust-covered desks and walls. Then I heard it, a dragging sound, very faint, like someone slowly pulling something heavy across the floor. I turned and whispered for Sullivan to cut the light. We both stood there in complete darkness, holding our breath. The dragging stopped. I wanted to believe it was just the building settling, maybe an animal. But then we heard it again, this time behind us. Sullivan spun around and shone his light toward the hallway. Nothing. He whispered, "Let's go." We retraced our steps quickly, but the layout of the place felt different. I swear the corridor was longer now. There were doors we hadn't passed before. One of them was slightly open. That's when we heard a voice. Not a whisper, not a shout, just a voice, low, gravelly, repeating the same word over and over. Down. We didn't wait to find out where it was coming from. We ran. I've never climbed a ladder so fast in my life. Sullivan was right behind me. We burst through the hatch and slammed it shut. The sound echoed in the empty air around us. We didn't say a word on the ride back. When we returned to the station, we filed a report. We left out the voice, the dragging sound. Just noted that we discovered an abandoned structure and that it might be unsafe. The next day, 2 men arrived by chopper. No patches, civilian clothes under their winter gear. They asked us a few questions. Then they left with the coordinates. 3 days later, the radar glitch stopped. The next rotation, I requested a transfer. So did Sullivan. We've only spoken about that night once since then. He doesn't talk much anymore. And sometimes when it's real quiet, I still hear that voice. Down. I used to work as a wilderness ranger in northern Montana, mostly patrolling national forests and logging safety reports. People often imagine it as this peaceful job, full of scenic hikes and fresh air. And yeah, sometimes it was, but there were other times, like the one I'm about to share, that still keep me awake at night. It was the tail end of autumn, the beginning of the quiet season. Most tourists were long gone, and the trails were empty. I had one last multi-day solo patrol to complete before our team shut things down for winter. This particular stretch of forest was remote, really remote. No cell service, no nearby towns, just long dirt roads, crumbling fire towers, and endless trees. I checked in at the ranger station on a Monday morning, picked up my gear, and signed out with my route and estimated return. Everything was normal. The first 2 days were uneventful. Cold, quiet, the kind of lonely you only feel when you haven't heard your own voice in hours. I saw elk tracks, a few foxes, and a single black bear from a distance. All things I'd expected. On the third night, I set up camp near an old fire lookout tower that hadn't been used in years. It was falling apart, but it still had some structural integrity, and I figured it'd make a good windbreak for the night. As I sat by the small fire, eating from a can and writing in my logbook, I heard a sound I couldn't quite place. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, like a soft tapping, faint but deliberate. I killed the fire and waited, flashlight in hand. The tapping continued, echoing faintly from somewhere in the trees beyond the clearing. Then it stopped. I stood still for a good 10 minutes, scanning the dark forest with my light, but saw nothing. Eventually I shook it off and turned in for the night, thinking it might have been a branch or an animal brushing past something. I woke up to find 3 small piles of stones placed outside my tent, perfectly stacked. Each pile had 5 stones. I hadn't heard a thing. Now, I've spent years in these woods, and I know the occasional oddity happens. People leave strange markers, symbols, or trail markers sometimes. But this wasn't like that. These weren't old. They were fresh, like someone had quietly walked into my camp while I was sleeping and left them. I radioed in a report. No response. Probably just interference, common in these areas. But something in me said it wasn't technical failure. It felt like a silence that wasn't accidental. I packed up quickly and decided to hike to the next checkpoint ahead of schedule. I told myself I'd finish early and head back a day early, maybe swing by the main outpost to report the weirdness. About halfway to the next checkpoint, I spotted something on the trail. A figure. It was standing just off the path, facing away from me, maybe 30 yards up. At first, I thought it was another ranger, maybe someone sent out to check on me. But there was no reason anyone would be out here without a vehicle, and I hadn't seen any tire tracks since leaving the station. I called out, "Hello?" No response, just silence. I got closer, cautiously, keeping my hand near the bear spray on my belt. The figure didn't move. When I got within 10 feet, I realized it wasn't a person. It was a scarecrow. A scarecrow. In the middle of a national forest. No farmhouses, no homesteads, nothing for miles. It was crude. Sticks and rags, the face made from what looked like stitched-together canvas. Someone had gone to the effort of dressing it in torn work clothes and even stuck a rusted old badge to the chest, like a parody of a ranger uniform. Pinned to the front was a note, scratched in shaky writing, "Do not follow." That was enough for me. I turned back. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I wanted to be part of. But as I retraced my steps, I found the trail. Wrong. It should have taken me straight back to where I camped the night before, but instead it twisted, diverged, and looped in ways I didn't recognize. I started marking trees with chalk every few hundred feet, but I kept seeing marks I hadn't made, sometimes 2, 3 on the same tree. Eventually, I stopped in my tracks. I was back at the scarecrow, only now it was facing me. Its stitched face tilted slightly, like it had been moved. I didn't sleep that night. I climbed into a tree with my gear and stayed awake, holding my flashlight, scanning the forest. Every few minutes I thought I saw movement in the